Hello and welcome to our Wednesday Bible study here from the Eubank Church of Christ as we continue our study in the book of Proverbs. We've been using the workbook published by Brother Mike Willis as a bit of a study guide as we've been working our way through the various concepts that are presented in the book of Proverbs. As we have mentioned, there are so many proverbs found in this book that we could spend a lengthy period of time trying to go verse by verse, looking at the content of all the different things that Solomon shared with us from his abundant wisdom. But instead, the authors kind of clumped them together into various themes, and that's what we're working with as we're going through our study. Today we are beginning lesson 5 in the workbook that we have on Proverbs, and the theme is making friends of God's children. It is so important that we learn how to make the right kind of friendships in this world. It seems to me that more and more we are able to see the very stark difference between the righteous and the unrighteous, those who are trying to do what's right and those who are determined to go the opposite direction in most every way possible. If we go to the questions at the back of lesson 5, it pretty well covers the material that is included for us in this study session. And as we start thinking about the idea of the kinds of friends and associations that Christians need to have, those people who want to follow God, the question that he asks in number 1 is, how does the Lord deliver us from the evil man? There are some folks out there whose eyes are set on evil, and God is not going to divinely intervene necessarily and just say, don't have anything to do with it. We've got to use the principles from the scripture to be able to think our way through relationships, see the problem areas, and avoid certain relationships and nurture those good ones. Here in Proverbs chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, Solomon said, My son, if thou wilt receive my words, and hide my commandments with thee, so that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom, and apply thine heart to understanding, then we'll see benefits that are to come. And he says down in verse 12, as he continues talking about those benefits, that this will deliver thee from the way of the evil man, from the man that speaketh froward things. When we've internalized the idea of right and wrong, it is going to make us more aware of the kind of people who can be of assistance to building us up and helping us in the cause of righteousness, and it will also help expose to us those who have no interest in spiritual things. In question 2, the author asks, why does a young man especially need the warning given in the book of Proverbs? There are several warnings specifically mentioned to younger men. One of those is over in chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. Here he's talking about the woman who would seduce those who would try to pull you into the evil way. He says, enter not into the path of the wicked, and go not in the way of evil men. Avoid it. Pass not by it, and turn from it, and pass away. The warning here that Solomon is giving is that there are some things you just don't need to fool with. They are evil, they are wrong, and you do not let yourself get enticed in these things. Don't allow yourself to build up a curiosity about these things. Instead, stay as far away from them as you possibly can. The young man especially needs his help and needs help from God in this area. All young people do, and yea, all of us need to be reminded about it. But to the young, they have a problem with inexperience. It makes them vulnerable. They may be more easily deceived. They haven't had a large experience base to pull from, in which they have learned to recognize that which is maybe deceptive and not what it first seems to be. So at the very first hint of evil, of transgression, of lawlessness, of a rejection of God, a person needs to turn around and go the other way, because very few times is that ever going to come to any kind of a beneficial end. Because we've got to kind of watch things. It kind of works like what I call the mousetrap principle. You put a mouse trap out and you put a bait on it. And, the mouse can be running around all over the house, but then there's something about that bait that is attractive. And so he comes closer to the trap. And maybe he begins to smell the fragrance of whatever the bait is. There is something enticing, something allurement, you hope, about this trap, because you want to catch that mouse. And so sure enough, it illustrates our point. The mouse simply cannot resist the allurement that is there. It begins to start taking that bait that's on the mouse trap, and if everything is set up as it should, all of a sudden, snap, and the mouse is history. Well, that's what can happen to us as we begin to flirt with sin, be enticed by its aroma, fragrance, and allurement, and we can be pulled into that same destruction. We must work to steer as far away from sin as we can. In question 3, the author asks, what character defects are manifested by one who thinks that he can be around sin and sinners without being affected? That's a problem that many will experience. They see themselves as so knowledgeable. They see themselves as so strong in the ways of truth that they're going to always be able to see through any of Satan's disguises. They're going to always perceive the sin, and they're not going to get trapped like other people do. Well, in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 27 and 28, Solomon simply asks, can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Can one go upon hot coals and his feet not be burned? That person who sees themselves as the know-it-all, that they are so strong that they cannot be seduced into sin, is simply setting themselves up for abject failure. There is a tremendous danger in our having that sense of overconfidence. In Proverbs chapter 10, going down to verse 23, Solomon said, it is as sport to a fool to do mischief, but a man of understanding hath wisdom. The individual who loves to do sinful things is very confident in what he's out to do. To him it's sport, to him it's enticing, to him it's fun. And we can get caught up in that same mentality, that there's an allurement, there is fun here, it's different than what other folks have warned me about, it's far different from what the preacher or those churchy people talk about I should do, and this actually seems like it's harmless to me, it's going to be fun, and so they wind up succumbing to sin and transgression, being pulled into a way of life that can physically destroy them in this life and spiritually destroy them when this life is over. You see, for many individuals, once they start down that slippery slope, then pride sets in. And when others are pleading with them to reform their ways, to turn back to righteousness, to don't behave in such a sinful manner, they close their ears and won't listen. Over in Proverbs 16, and going down to verse 18, Solomon said, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Whenever pride sets in, that arrogance sets in, individuals then close their ears. The truth does not appeal to them. No one knows what they're saying. They're the only one with perfect understanding, and all the rest of the world is seeing this incorrectly. And so when that mindset prevails, trying to urge someone to repent is a painfully difficult process that oftentimes meets with failure. So Solomon is saying, don't let yourself start down this slippery slope. Don't have these defects in your character, these weaknesses that make you more susceptible to going into a life of sin. In question 4, he says, what attitude of sinners is described in Proverbs chapter 4 and going down to verse 16. Here, in talking about the two paths that people can choose to follow, he makes the point here in verse 14, enter not into the path of the wicked, and go not in the way of evil men. Avoid it, pass not by it, turn from it, and pass away. For they sleep not, except they have done mischief, and their sleep is taken away, unless they cause some to fall. For they that eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. But the path of the just is as the shining light, that shineth more and more unto the perfect day. The way of the wicked is as darkness. They know not at what they stumble. Here, Solomon is making the point that the sinner is just obsessed with his sinful set of ethics. To him, the goal is to trip up other people. The goal to him is to take advantage of other people. The goal that he possesses is to satisfy himself and do the things that he wants to do. And often he'll lose sleep. He'll be up all night, wanting to use the cover of darkness to hide his mischief and his evil deeds. And he wants nothing to do with righteousness, godliness, and the idea of being reproved of his sin. He wants to stay in both physical and spiritual darkness, doing that which is sinful and wrong. And then when his calamity befalls him, it's like, what? I understand. How did this happen? Because they walked down that road that took them to that end, and they had deafened ears to anyone who tried to get them to see the folly of their way. In question 5, the author says, give some modern examples of the invitation of sinners to join with them in the practices of sin. Well, it's all around us. Let's say, for example, you see those individuals who want to make fast money in the drug trade. They want others to have an addiction. They want others to spend money buying supplies from them. And so they will make it seem innocent, that it's going to be a partying situation. It will make you feel good. It's going to be what everybody else is doing, so you need to be involved. And whether it be drugs, whether it be alcohol, these are called vices for a reason. People get into them at risk and peril to themselves, and often develop an addiction that they can't walk away from. And so in order to see the allurement of that, the drug dealer doesn't want you to see a broken, desperate life where you're stealing and struggling to get the money to uphold your habit. Instead, he wants to show you the good side, the innocent side, the fun side, supposedly, that's at the beginning. And so he will want to cover the depth of the iniquity. Or there will be those who want to dare you. You're not much of a man if you won't take this drink. Are you chicken? They want to pressure you using whatever peer pressure is available at their disposal to push you into doing things that are sinful, wrong, and even immoral. Oftentimes, sex crimes of all sorts and violence and theft all come as a result of someone daring them to do it. Oftentimes, gang initiations are involved in being able to get someone or goad someone into performing acts of violence and doing wrong toward other people to prove their worthiness to be in the gang. There are some who see no sinful problems with pornography and watching the filth that is readily available today. Come over to the house and we'll watch dirty movies, or come over to the house, I've got some great porn that I know you want to see. Trying to dull our senses to the beauties of sex and the right relationships that God has in store for us. So all of these things are in the mix. Calling out to come do, enjoy this. The pleasures of sin are here. Come and have a grand time. But as Paul teaches us in Romans chapter 6, the wages of sin is death. So in question 6, the author asks, what kind of man is described by the word fool, as it is used here in a couple of passages, here in Proverbs at chapter 13. And going down to verse 20, here he's talking about individuals who choose to do foolish things. He says, he that walketh with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed. Whenever you start listening to the wrong voices, it's going to cause you trouble. Over in Proverbs at chapter 14 and going down to verse 7, Solomon continues. He says, go from the presence of a foolish man, when thou perceivest not in him the lips of knowledge. There are some folks where you just have to recognize what they're after, see their sinful desires and what they're trying to do, and you got to get away from them. Now, whenever the Bible talks about the idea of a person being a fool, this is a serious charge to make. But nonetheless, the scriptures give qualification as to who qualifies in that regard. One example is over in Psalms 14 and verse 1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. You're going to meet those ungodly people who have no sense at all of fearing God and wanting to serve Him. God doesn't exist. It's all those churchy freaks that you run around with that have corrupted your thinking. The religion's just been made up by man back through the years as some kind of crutch. You need to be bold. You need to be brave. You need to do your own thing. And so they deny the existence of God, have no fear of Him, and do abominable things. And they want your support and they want your participation in doing those things as validation for themselves, as they say, see, I knew that there was nothing to that church thing. Over in Psalm 74 and going down to verse 22, the psalmist says, arise, O God, plead thine own cause. Remember how the foolish man reproacheth thee daily. All you have to do is listen to some folks, and pretty soon you hear them taking the name of God in vain, making fun of religion, laughing at righteousness, trying to show godliness as a stupid way to live. Here the psalmist says that that's the foolish man talking. That's the man who does not know up from down, right from wrong. You know, as we mentioned from Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 25 a little while ago, to the individual who is the foolish individual, he's a fool because all he wants to do is to participate in mischief and misbehavior. It's sport to him. I've had students in school that really enjoyed being obnoxious, enjoyed being disrespectful. It was their show of rebellion. They didn't have to listen to anybody. They were not going to comply with any requests, regardless how legitimate, because they weren't going to have anybody telling them what to do. That includes their parents. That includes authority figures. That even includes God. Folks like that are individuals that we have to limit our exposure to, because that same aroma of ungodliness, that enticement of the sinful bait, can be something that rubs off on us. Another group of individuals that Solomon advises us not to associate with is the angry man, the individual who is filled with rage, the individual who loses his temper so very, very easily. In Proverbs 23, verses 24 and 25, that's the question that's the focus of question 7 in our workbook. What kind of man is described as an angry man? It says, well, the father of the righteous shall greatly rejoice, and he that begetteth a wise child shall have joy in him. Thy father and thy mother shall be glad that she bare thee, and shall rejoice. There you see the portrait of what happens when you have the good man, the good child, that individual who listens to instruction and does what they should. But there are many who do not want to comply with that model. That's not what they want. They hurt and cause shame to their families, and they don't care. Over in Proverbs 14, going down to verse 29, here the psalmist says, he that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. There are some folks who have what they used to call a hair trigger temper. This is the individual who flies off the handle at the simplest provocation. These are some of those who are abusers at home. Domestic violence toward wives and children. Those who are quick to get into a barroom fight. They're willing to go to violence over everything so very, very quickly. Because we also notice that these angry men are right in the middle of strife. Over in Proverbs 15 and going down to verse 18. A wrathful man stirreth up strife, but he that is slow to anger appeaseth strife. The wise man doesn't want trouble. He wants to come to sensible conclusions. But to the wrathful man, let's take it outside. All they want to do is fight and to try and prevail over others by their sheer meanness, brute strength, and intimidation. Those are not the kind of people that godly folks need to run with. These are the individuals who are habitually in trouble. Over in Proverbs chapter 19 and going down to verse 19. A man of great wrath shall suffer punishment, for if thou deliver him, yet thou must do it again. How many times do we see individuals with prison records? They didn't make just one mistake where they learned from that and reformed their ways. But they have a rap sheet that's a mile long. They've done one thing after another, and they were punished, but then went right back to the same kinds of crimes they were committing, or maybe even worse. Those are the individuals that we need to stay away from. And individuals who are in this category, the angry men, are those individuals whose lives are simply plagued with one problem after another. Their hair is on fire all the time because there's always another disaster. There's always some other problem that they're up against. They've done something else for which they are running or trying to cover their tracks. In Proverbs 29 and going down to verse 22, Solomon says, an angry man stirreth up strife, and a furious man aboundeth in transgressions. It's not just a one-time thing. They've developed a pattern of living, of making bad choices over and over and over again. Christians do not want to get ensnared with that. We find that the next question, question 8 in the workbook, is what kind of company is forbidden here in Proverbs 23, beginning in verse 19. Proverbs 23, beginning in verse 19. Hear thou, my son, and be wise, and guide thine heart in thine way. Be not among wine-bibbers, among riotous eaters of flesh. For the drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty, and drowsiness shall clothe a man with rags. There are some folks who want to be rough and ready. They are the drunkards, as it's interpreted in the English Standard Version in verse 20. They're the gluttons who have no restraint or manners about their eating. They simply stuff their faces and laugh about how obscene and how obnoxious they're behaving. And these individuals are all about self. And so slothfulness seems to follow them. They're going to be clothed with rags. They don't listen to any of the advice that's given unto them. And as a result, their lazy and undisciplined way of life brings them to poverty. And they never understand why they never have enough, why they never can get by. Well, everybody else is doing well, but I'm always struggling. Well, oftentimes it simply goes back to their very, very poor choice making. In question number 9, the author says, what kind of company is forbidden in Proverbs 19 and going down to verse 27? Here Solomon says, cease, my son, to hear the instruction that causeth to err from the words of knowledge. There are some folks out there who are going to try their best to persuade you and to talk you into doing things that are wrong. And they themselves are pretty unteachable. Those are the individuals that the Lord talked about in Matthew 11 and verse 15, Matthew 13 and verse 9, and Matthew 13 and verse 43, when Jesus used the phrase, he that hath ears to hear, let him hear. To those who are seeking to do right things and follow God, those are the individuals who will listen to the word of God and respond. But there are some who don't have the ears to hear. They're already dull of hearing, All that you say is like water off a duck's back. They are not yet willing to listen. And as long as they continue on in that mindset, those are not the people that Christians need to have amongst their friends. We find in question 10, the author asks, give 3 reasons for avoiding the wicked. Well, the first one that we've noticed is that you can learn their ways. You can start acting like them. You can start running with individuals, for example, who use filthy language. And guess what? Before long, it's going to start coming out of your mouth, too. You can run with people who lie to get out of responsibility and trouble. Pretty soon you find yourself being caught up in that same habit of not telling the truth if you think it will get you out of a jam. You don't want to learn their wicked ways. In Proverbs 4, beginning in verse 14, remember, he said, enter not into the path of the wicked, go not into the way of the evil men, avoid it, pass not by it, turn from it and pass away. He said you want to stay as far away from that as you can. But so often there's that fragrance and allurement. Oh, that bait looks so enticing. Over in Proverbs 22, verses 24 and 25, Solomon says, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man thou shalt not go, lest thou learn his ways and get a snare to thy soul. So you don't want to hang with the wicked because it's going to rub off. It's also going to bring your own destruction, because as you start picking up on their habits and being in the proximity with them, you will soon begin to earn for yourself their same degree of bad reputation. Over in Proverbs 13 and verse 20, he that walketh with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed. We're taught in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7 that we're going to reap what we sow. And if we're going to run with the wicked and participate in their folly, we may think it's only just a little bit, but if we participate in their folly, we're going to bring a bunch of destruction and sorrow upon ourselves. And then, as we've noticed, when we start doing wicked things, running with the wicked, doing those things that are contrary to all that our godly parents have tried to teach us, we bring shame on the whole family. They go to bed crying about the iniquity of their wayward children who won't listen to truth, will not listen to reason, and will not reform their ways, nor are they able to take care of themselves or their own children. Over in Proverbs 28 and verse 7, but whoso keepeth the law is a wise son, but he that is a companion of riotous men shameth his father. Many a parent has been pulled into court or pulled before authorities because they had children who had begun to enjoy sinful ways and wouldn't listen to their parents or anybody else. Question 11, the author says, with whom should one associate? Well, in Psalm 119, and going down to verse 63, the psalmist helps us to understand who we should run with. He says, I am a companion of all them that fear thee, and of them that keep thy precepts. We want to be with those who fear God. And as we've noticed from Proverbs 13 and verse 20, we want to listen to wise men, to individuals who can share us the secrets of an abundant life and godliness and righteousness, wise decision making, so that we can live in a way pleasing in the sight of God. In question 12, how does one's choice of friends reflect his own moral standards? Well, those that we seek and admire as our role models reflect the moral standards that we value. It's sad that in our society we have done such a bang-up job of destroying decent role models. If anybody is looked upon with favor and being someone you would want to emulate, someone who is godly and successful and doing well, then the media and others will not cease until they try to dig up every mistake and possible problem that they can ever unearth and find about that person. And we all have our mistakes. But what happens is there are folks who are trying to do good, and yet there's forces out there to crush everybody. But what happens in this is if we choose the wrong kind of role model, those who are drug users, those who are immoral in their behavior, those that are filled with the idea of riotous living and inappropriate things, then we'll soon try to become a rebel just like they are. They rebel against God, so we want to rebel against God too. We need to find people who have the right moral standards and strive to use them as an inspiration for good to us, so that we are spurred on to do good and godly things and to see the reward of that. In question 13, he says, describe the progress of digression of someone who has been corrupted by his friends. What happens and how could it have been avoided? That's a tough one. And the examples, though, are just so multiple around us that we could cite all kinds of things. But the ones that come to my mind are individuals who maybe grew up in the church and knew the difference between right and wrong, but they began to develop a certain admiration for the rebels, for the sinful ones who dared to show disrespect to authority and dared to break the rules. And they admired that courage and that disobedience. And they found a way to justify their ways, that no one understands them, nobody is giving them a fair shake, and other such rationalizations are used to keep that association. And then an individual begins to run with them, and they begin to participate more and more in sinful behavior. And then if they begin to say, I don't want to go this far, I don't want to be in this, and they begin to try to pull back into some of their old paths of righteousness, now they are shamed for having any good thoughts, shamed for being soft, shamed for not being bold enough to follow through, and so they just collapse. Because these folks want to fit in so badly with the crowd that they have chosen, and they want the acceptance of that evil crowd, that they sell out their convictions completely to practice sinful things. And then finally, what can a parent do to aid his children in choosing good friends? Well, what happens so often in that regard is that we think that maybe the way to keep our kids safe is to build a wall around them and not let them have any associations with anybody else. And we'll just keep them in this little protected bubble, and they're going to turn out fine. Well, one day they'll be out of that bubble. And if we haven't instilled in them the kind of principles that we've been talking about, where they've learned to recognize sin and learned how to avoid it and to run from it, then one day it's going to catch up with them. We've got to teach the values of godliness early on in life. To hold up individuals as positive role models, godly men and women, godly young people who have made good choices, and what a wonderful reputation they've had, and how they are such a source of pride to their parents and righteous in the sight of God. We need to sometimes maybe use illustrations of those that are around us who have kind of crashed and burned because of their sinful choices, and say, see where that can take you? When you make those poor choices, it brings you to that horrible conclusion. These pieces of instruction need to be made early, so that we don't find ourselves waiting till the very last minute and suddenly deciding, oh, that boy that my girl wants to date is a bad guy, so I'm going to make this stop. I'm going to intervene. I'm going to get involved. And then you have two to fight. Because now even your own child, who has not yet understood why you're being so protective, may actually side with the adversary that you're wanting to stay away from. The instruction needs to come early and to be consistent, that there's values in doing righteousness and there are consequences in doing evil. There may be those times when desperate measures have to be taken. An intervention of some sort has to be involved. I've known parents that have actually moved to another town to get away from some sinful influences. But the fact is, those influences are going to be around you everywhere. And so we've got to create, as the psalmist said, create in me a clean heart. Help me to love righteousness. Help me to want to do what's right, so that the waywardness of sin is not going to have its appeal. And then finally, the last question says, what can a parent do in this? Well, we have to simply continue to fight the good fight And it's going to be hard because Satan's after our kids. He's wanting young people to fall away. He's wanting babes in Christ to be overcome with the cares and struggles of this life, to fall away from the Lord and turn their back on Him and to go back into the ways of the world. He wants to make sin look innocent and good when really it's not. And so we have to help them understand that both in this life and in the life to come, serving God's the right thing to do. Wise individuals seek out the counsel of wise folks. They listen to their fathers and mothers' instruction in righteousness. They go to the Word of God for their guidance. They love the precepts that they find there, and they see that those have the keys of life. That instruction helps them to do right things. And the sky's the limit as to where God's blessings can take them as they do those things that are right in His sight. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our class today as we've gone through Lesson 5 in this workbook study in Proverbs. And as we've talked about those folks that you don't need to choose as friends, and how we should learn to sharpen our skills in being able to make a difference between who's the good friend to have and who's the not so good friend to have. And we would like to hope that we find those righteous friends amongst the children of God. Individuals who are genuinely trying to do what's right. Now, sometimes that's not a guarantee. Even in the church, there are sometimes young people who will come and sit in the pew because they can't wait to get out the door and get into all kinds of mischief. But we've got to learn to see through their chameleon-type changing, their hypocrisy, and say, maybe that's not the road I want to go down. I want to be good, as the old expression goes, all the way to the bone. And I hope that our lesson today has helped us to understand some of the consequences of hanging with the wrong folks and the importance of hanging with the right ones. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope that you'll join us next week as we continue our study in the book of Proverbs.